I set the envelope on the kitchen table and walked back to my chair by the window like nothing had happened. My hands weren't shaking. I was surprised by that. 67 years old, and I'd just done something that would change everything, and my hands were perfectly still. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to the Tuesday it started. The Tuesday I saw what my son-in-law did to my coffee. I have a farmhouse about 40 minutes outside of Columbus. 3 acres, a barn I don't use anymore, and a vegetable garden my wife started 20 years before she passed. I kept the garden going after she died. It was the only thing that made sense to do. Every spring I put in tomatoes, peppers, squash, and a row of marigolds along the south edge because she always said marigolds kept the aphids off. My daughter moved back in 2 years ago. She said it was temporary, just until she and her husband got back on their feet. They'd had some financial trouble. I didn't ask too many questions. She was my only child. You don't interrogate your only child when she comes home. Her husband came with her, of course, a man named Court Wexler. He sold insurance, or had sold it, or was thinking about selling it again. I was never quite sure which one was true at any given moment. He had the kind of handshake that felt like he was doing you a favor by completing it. I had never fully warmed to him, even at the wedding 6 years before, but I kept that to myself. My daughter loved him. That was enough for me. They took the 2 rooms at the end of the hall. My daughter talked about fixing the place up, painting the trim, maybe putting in new countertops. Court talked about looking into refinancing options. Not for me. He was clear about that, just speaking generally. He liked to speak generally. It was harder to pin him down that way. The first few months were fine. My daughter cooked a few nights a week, and we ate together at the big table. Court would pour wine and make conversation about the news. I'd listen more than I'd talk. It felt almost like a family, in the blurry way that almost families do. Then things started to shift. Small things first. My mail. I'd had a habit of collecting it myself every afternoon around 3 o'clock. Just a short walk to the end of the driveway. Good excuse to stretch my legs. One day it was already inside when I went out. My daughter said she'd grabbed it on her way in. I didn't think anything of it. Then my bank statements stopped arriving. I'd been getting paper statements since the 90s. I knew what day of the month to expect them. When 2 months went by without one, I called the bank. The woman on the phone told me my account had been switched to paperless delivery. I said I hadn't requested that. She said the change had been made online. I didn't own a computer. I had a telephone that my grandson had set up for me, and I used it to call people and occasionally to look at weather forecasts, but I had never logged into my bank account online in my life. I said thank you and hung up the phone. I stood in the kitchen for a long time. Then I called the bank back from my bedroom, with the door shut. I asked them to switch me back to paper statements. I also asked them to read me the recent transactions on my account. I listened carefully. Most of it was normal, the utility bill, the grocery store, my monthly pharmacy charge. But there were 3 cash withdrawals I didn't recognize. Each one was for $400. Each one had been made at an ATM in a town about 12 miles away, on weekdays between 9 and 11 in the morning. Weekdays between 9 and 11 were when my daughter usually said she was running errands. I thanked the woman and hung up. I went and sat in my chair by the window. Outside, the marigolds were just starting to come up along the south edge of the garden. My wife had always said you had to be patient with marigolds. Plant them, water them, and then just wait. They'd tell you what they needed. I decided to be patient. The Tuesday I'm talking about was 6 weeks after that phone call. I had gotten into the habit of waking early and making coffee before either of them came downstairs. I liked the quiet of the kitchen at 6 in the morning, the light coming in gray and thin through the window over the sink. I'd read the newspaper if it had come, or just sit. That Tuesday I'd made my coffee and set it on the table and gone back to rinse out the pot. I was at the sink, maybe 15 feet away, with my back turned. I heard the soft sound of a cabinet opening. I didn't turn around. I kept rinsing the pot. Slow and steady, the way you do when you're not in a hurry. I heard a small click, the kind a small bottle or vial makes when you set it down on a hard surface. Then a very faint sound, like liquid being tipped out carefully. Deliberate, quiet. Then footsteps moving back toward the hall, soft and quick. I waited until I heard the stairs creak. Then I turned around. My coffee mug was sitting exactly where I'd left it. Nothing looked different. Nothing looked disturbed. I picked up the mug and poured the coffee down the sink. Then I made myself a fresh cup and sat down at the table and waited for my daughter to come downstairs. She came down about 20 minutes later, already dressed, her hair done. She seemed surprised to find me sitting there with a full cup of coffee. She looked at the cup. Then she looked at me. "Morning, Dad," she said. "You're up early." "Always am," I said. "Sleep good?" "Pretty well," she said. She went to the refrigerator and opened it, and I watched her in my peripheral vision. Her movements were careful, deliberate, the same way those sounds had been deliberate. "Court still sleeping?" I asked. "He'll be down," she said. I finished my coffee and said I was going to check the garden. She said okay. She didn't watch me leave, but I felt it when she stopped pretending to look in the refrigerator. I walked out to the garden and stood between the rows of pepper plants and looked back at the house. The kitchen window was bright with the morning light. I couldn't see her, but I knew she was still in there. I stood there for a while, listening to the birds. Then I went to find my phone and called the one man in the world I trusted completely. His name is Tad Warrow. We've been friends since our 20s, back when we were both working construction in the summer to put ourselves through school. He became a lawyer. I became a civil engineer. We'd had dinner twice a year every year since 1981, except for the year his wife was sick. I told him what I'd seen. Tad didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Don't react. Don't tip your hand." I told him I'd already poured the coffee out. "Good," he said, "but don't do anything that changes your routine. You're still the same man, living the same life." "Can you do that?" I said I thought I could. "I'm going to make some calls," he said. "I want you to do something for me. Go to the hardware store today and buy a small digital recorder, the kind people use for meetings. Put it in your shirt pocket. Turn it on in the morning and leave it running." I wrote it down on the back of an envelope the way I used to write things down before everyone kept their notes in their phones. "Tad," I said, "how bad is this?" He was quiet for a second. Then he said, "I don't know yet. But I need you to be careful, Owen." He always called me Owen when he was being serious. Most people called me by my last name, Bassett. My daughter called me Dad. Tad called me Owen when it mattered. I said I'd be careful. I bought the recorder that afternoon while my daughter thought I was at the pharmacy. It was a small silver thing about the size of a deck of cards. I practiced turning it on and off in the car before I drove home. That evening I sat at the dinner table while Court talked about interest rates, and my daughter asked me if I'd thought any more about what I wanted to do with the back 40 acres of the property. I said I hadn't thought about it much. She said that Court had some ideas, if I was ever interested in hearing them. I said sure, sometime. Court looked at me with that insurance salesman's steadiness, the kind of look that's calibrated to seem warm without giving anything away. "No rush," he said. "Just want to make sure you've got options, Norman." He called me Norman. My name is Owen Bassett. He had called me Norman twice before, and both times I'd corrected him, mildly, and both times he'd apologized and moved on. That night I let it go. I had the recorder in my shirt pocket. Over the next 3 weeks, I learned things. I learned that Court had been talking to a real estate attorney in Columbus. Not the kind of attorney who helps you buy a house, but the kind who specializes in estate planning and property disputes. My daughter let this slip while she was on the phone in the kitchen one morning, not realizing I was sitting in the hallway that ran alongside it. I had the recorder on. I learned that Court had been telling people I didn't know, people he apparently knew from his insurance days, that I was starting to slip. That was the phrase my daughter used when she talked to her cousin on the phone one afternoon. "Dad's starting to slip a little. It's been hard to watch." Her voice had the right texture of concern. It was convincing. I had to give her that. I learned that my truck had been moved without my knowledge on at least 2 occasions. I keep track of the mileage. I have since I bought it. It's a habit from when I was younger and trying to manage costs. The numbers didn't add up the way they should have. And I learned, from a conversation I only heard part of through my bedroom door late one Thursday night, that Court had spoken to someone he referred to as the doctor. I couldn't make out the full conversation. I heard the words competency evaluation, and then Court's low, measured laugh. I lay in bed and looked at the ceiling. My wife used to say that I was the most patient man she'd ever known, and also the most stubborn. She meant both as compliments. I held on to both of them that night. I called Tad the next morning from my truck, parked at the end of a gravel road a mile from the house. He listened to everything I told him. He asked me to describe exactly what I'd heard. I described it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Owen, I think they're planning to have you declared incompetent. If they can do that, or even get close to it, they can challenge your capacity to manage your estate." That opens the door to guardianship, and guardianship opens the door to everything else. I said I understood. I need you to do a few things, he said. First, I want you to come into my office this week. We're going to review your will, your deed, your accounts. Everything. I want everything current and airtight. Second, I need you to keep recording. Everything I said I would. Third, he said and paused. Is there anyone else who can vouch for your clarity of mind? A neighbor? A doctor? I thought of my neighbor Percival, who I'd known for 30 years. He came over every other Saturday to drink bad coffee and argue about baseball. I thought of my regular doctor, a woman named Dr. Absher, who I'd been seeing for 15 years, who knew me well enough to know when I was exaggerating a symptom and when I wasn't. I told Tad their names. Good, he said. Get appointments with both of them. Routine visits. Nothing that looks irregular. Just make sure there's a recent record of you being exactly who you are. I scheduled a physical with Dr. Absher for the following Monday. I called Percival that afternoon and told him I'd bought a new kind of coffee bean and wanted his assessment. He said he'd be over Saturday. I kept recording. The thing about pretending to be someone you're not is that it costs you something, even when you're doing it for good reasons. I'd been a straight-talking person my whole life. I didn't dissemble. My wife used to tease me about it, said I had no poker face whatsoever, that I couldn't hide a thing, that the whole world could read my expression like a headline. She said she'd always known when I was proud of something or upset about something, or thinking about something I didn't know how to say. So playing the confused old man at the dinner table, letting a beat pass before I answered a question, letting my eyes go a little unfocused when Court talked about the property situation, setting my fork down and looking at my plate as if I'd forgotten what I was doing. It went against everything in me, but I did it. Every evening. I let them see what they wanted to see. The morning I saw what I saw, I'd been ready. 3 weeks earlier, I'd quietly added Tad as a co-trustee on my property trust. I'd moved the liquid assets in my savings account to a new account that existed only in my name at a bank across town. I'd taken the deed out of the house files and brought it to Tad's office. I'd signed updated documents that made everything official, everything clear. The house was mine. The land was mine. My will was current and unambiguous, and witnessed by 2 people who had no connection to my daughter or her husband. I had done all of this quietly, in the cracks of ordinary days, while Court talked about the property situation at dinner, and my daughter looked at me with what I now recognized as calculation dressed up as concern. The conversation I'd been waiting for happened on a Wednesday evening. I'd made soup for dinner, beef and barley, from a recipe of my wife's that I'd made so many times I didn't need to look at it anymore. I set the bowls on the table and called them down, and then excused myself to get the bread from the kitchen. When I came back to the doorway, I stopped. Court was leaning toward my bowl. His hand moved quickly, deliberately, and then withdrew. He sat back and picked up his spoon as if he'd been reaching for the salt. I stood in the doorway with the bread in my hands. He hadn't seen me. I walked back to the kitchen. I set the bread on the counter. I stood at the counter for exactly 60 seconds, counting in my head. Then I picked up both pieces of bread, walked back to the table, and sat down. Court, I said, would you mind switching spots with me tonight? The light's getting in my eyes from that angle. He looked at me. Just for a second, something moved across his face. Then the insurance salesman's smoothness came back, and he said, Of course, Norman. No problem at all. We switched. He sat in front of my original bowl. I sat in front of his. Dad, you've been so quiet lately, my daughter said, ladling from the pot on the table. You feeling okay? Just tired, I said. Old bones. She smiled at me. It was a kind smile, the kind she'd given me all her life, and for a moment I let myself grieve it. Whatever had happened to the girl who used to fall asleep on my shoulder on long car trips, who'd called me from college whenever she was scared about something, who had placed her hand in mine at her mother's funeral and held on until it was over? I grieved it quietly, in the space of that one breath. Then I picked up my spoon and ate my soup. Court was sick the next morning. He didn't come downstairs until almost noon, and when he did, he was pale and unsteady. My daughter hovered around him with a glass of water, and a look I couldn't quite read. Concern, yes, but something else underneath it, something tighter. Maybe something you ate, I said from my chair. He looked at me. I looked back at him, calm and unhurried, with the recorder in my shirt pocket, and 3 weeks of his voice I was already saved on the little silver device in my drawer. Maybe, he said. I called Tad that afternoon. It happened, I said. I switched the bowls. He was quiet for a second. Then, "Are you safe?" "I'm fine," I said. "He got sick. Not badly. I don't know what it was, whatever he put in there." "I didn't eat any of it, Owen," Tad said. "I need you to listen to me. This is now a criminal matter. What you've described, this is beyond what I practice. I've already been in contact with a colleague who handles exactly this kind of case, and I think it's time." I said I agreed. "Can you get out of the house for a few hours tomorrow morning?" he said. "Come to my office. Bring the recorder." I said I'd tell them I had a doctor's appointment. "Good. And Owen, don't be alone with either of them tonight if you can help it." I said I understood. That evening I told my daughter I wasn't feeling well and was going to turn in early. She said okay. She brought me a glass of water, unsolicited, which I thanked her for and set on the nightstand and didn't drink. I lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of the house. Tad's colleague was a woman named Giselle Fontaine. She was in her mid-50s, sharp and unhurried in the way that good lawyers tend to be, and she listened to the recordings on Tad's laptop without saying anything for a long time. When she was done, she looked at me and said, "Mr. Bassett, I want you to understand what you have here. This is more than most people walk in with." I said I'd been methodical. She almost smiled. "What I'd like to do," she said, "is work with local law enforcement to open a formal investigation. Simultaneously, we need to file for a protective order on your assets. Based on what you've told us about the cash withdrawals and the account changes, there may already be grounds for financial elder abuse charges." I asked what that meant for my daughter. Giselle looked at me steadily. "That depends on what she knew and when she knew it. It's possible she was the primary driver of this. It's also possible she was following his lead. The investigation will determine that." I thought about the girl who'd held my hand at her mother's funeral. I said, "Find the truth, whatever it is." They came on a Friday morning. I was in the garden when I heard the cars on the gravel drive. I'd known they were coming. Giselle had told me the day before, but I'd wanted to be outside. I'd wanted to be in the place where my wife's marigolds came up every spring. I heard voices inside the house. Quartz's voice rising, then going flat. My daughter's voice, high and confused at first, then very quiet. I stayed in the garden. A deputy came out about 20 minutes later and walked toward me across the yard. He was young, with a serious face. He told me they'd need me to come inside and answer a few questions. I said, "Of course." I walked back to the house with my hands steady at my sides. Quartz was charged with elder financial abuse and criminal tampering. That was the charge that came from what he'd put in my soup. The substance turned out to be a prescription sedative, the kind used in high doses to cause disorientation, the kind that would have made a 67-year-old man seem confused and unstable and increasingly unfit to manage his own affairs. He had obtained it through a contact he'd made through his old insurance network, someone who had access to pharmaceutical samples. That detail came out later, in the discovery process, and it answered the question I'd had since that first morning, at the sink. My daughter was charged with conspiracy and financial fraud. The cash withdrawals, the account changes, the paperless switch. She had done those things herself. She hadn't been a bystander. She had been a participant. The district attorney told me they had sufficient evidence for both charges. Giselle said she'd keep me informed of every development. I drove home from that meeting alone, along the county road I'd driven 10,000 times since I first moved out here, past the feed store and the Methodist church and the long fences that meant the Hargrove property began. The radio was off. The windows were down. It was the kind of late spring afternoon that my wife would have called a gift, warm but not hot, the air still carrying just a little of the morning's cool underneath it. I turned into my driveway and sat in the truck for a minute before I got out. Then I went inside, put the kettle on, and called Percival to see if he was free Saturday. He said yes. I said I'd make the coffee. I hung up and stood in my kitchen, in the quiet of that ordinary afternoon, and I thought about what my wife used to say about marigolds. Plant them. Water them. Wait. They'll tell you what they need.